This presentation will explore themes and theories concerned with power and practice. We'll start with practice, or sometimes referred to as praxis theory, and we'll draw especially on Sherry Ortner's publication that looks at theory and anthropology. So practice we can think of as anything that people do. So this set of ideas and concerns and theories are trying to put more emphasis on the actions of ordinary living, everyday living, and theorize those actions. What is especially interesting, though, are the actions that occur in the context of asymmetrical relations. So where there's a power differential, what kinds of actions do people engage in? So there is an interest in understanding the impact of practice, or what people do, on the system, as well as the impact of the system on practice. And this is drawing on the work of sociologist Anthony Giddens, who wrestled with structure and agency. So the system and structure are trying to get at more or less the same things, which include culture and society, but also power structures, power holders, and institutions. In a modern society, we can think about institutions like the court system, the Supreme Court, the educational system, whether it's a Ministry of Education or a Department of Education or a school district. It's looking at those institutions. It could be religious institutions. In a smaller scale society, you may be analyzing different types of institutions like the family, spiritual belief systems. The system or the structure should be approached as an integral whole. So you're trying to understand how everything works together. You're not breaking it apart and looking at it piece by piece. And then we have the concept of agency, which is related to this idea of practice. Agency is something that individuals and groups can have, and it entails seeing and acting in a way that opposes the structure. So it's observing and understanding what is going on and how things work, and being concerned about that in a sense, or opposing it, and therefore acting in a way that pushes back against that structure. So important concepts when thinking about practice theory include constraint, hegemony, and symbolic domination. So constraint is recognizing that the system is powerful and it shapes or even constrains what people see, what they think, and what they do. Along similar lines, hegemony, that idea that we can actually kind of control people in some ways just by controlling what they believe, by controlling ideology. And symbolic domination, so controlling people, dominating people, holding power over people through symbolic mechanisms. So it's not using military strength or police force or violence. It's doing so through shaping their belief systems. So ideology is very important here. It's the system of beliefs that knowingly or unknowingly influences perspectives. And power structures shape ideology. The ideology that exists is going to be a reflection of power holders and their belief systems and their interests. So then, depending on the society and how sophisticated of a system of power exists, ideology can be a very important mechanism for maintaining power and controlling people. So practice theory is related to other theories. It's building certainly in ways on symbolic anthropology and the work of Clifford Geertz, who we have considered. He was interested very much so in the actor's point of view. And agency and practice, they're about what people are doing, what people are thinking, what people are seeing, what people are saying. So it's not just that person, the anthropologist or sociologist, standing outside and observing and having that external or outsider's perspective. It's actually what people are saying and thinking and doing. We've also considered Weber and his influence. He's influenced anthropology and the social sciences by arguing for a meaning-centered approach. So what what do things mean to people, and how does that then shape what they do? So understanding that people are actors and what they do is shaped by meaning. And again, also he argued for the importance of understanding rather than just trying to explain the native point of view or that insider perspective. And then we're also responding here with practice theory and this interest in power. We're responding to structuralism, which we've already considered through the work of Levi-Strauss. It's this, with Levi-Strauss, we looked at the binaries, the idea that we can kind of understand societies by understanding, in sort of simplistic terms, the binaries, hot and cold, day and night, and so on. So practice theory is a reaction to what some people found to be a very limiting lens through which to consider culture, and it is in a way a critique of structuralism. Let's introduce the work of Pierre Bourdieu. He very much contributed to theorizing what we mean by practice. He was a social scientist. He worked in Algeria. It was a colony, this country in Africa was a colony of France until 1962. So what he witnessed as Algeria was a colony and then as Algeria sought to gain independence is influential in terms of his interests and his theories. So Bourdieu wrote in art, literature, and education, as well as anthropology and sociology. So he's a pretty influential figure in the social sciences in general. He wrote in French, and so in the United States, most of us work with translations of his work. And again, he studied Algerian peasant life. The independence process was very violent in Algeria, and the French were the way that things unfolded. France did a lot of things that were quite horrific, really. So he's interested also in practice, and he argues that what you'll see is a mixture of freedom and constraint. So people have that agency, they have sort of this independence, regardless of the power of ideology and structures that constrain them, but they are in some ways constrained by those systems. He also argued that people create, reproduce, and change based on social relations. So those relations between people are very important, relations within a society. People are not just simply following rules. So they're negotiating the rules within that society, but then through relations and as well as individual beliefs and behaviors and so on, they can potentially change, modify, question, and challenge. One of the ideas, the concepts that Bourdieu developed was the concept of habitus. And Ortner argues this concept is similar to the way anthropologists in the United States conceptualize culture. But he articulated what he meant by habitus with some of the points here. He argued it's an acquired disposition, so it's not something a person's born with. It's rooted in history, in the history of the society or the cultural group. It involves practical knowledge, so what we know, but also emotions. It's customary, so it's sort of what people do, what people are understood that they should be doing. It's not individual, so it's bigger than the individual. It involves both the conscious and the unconscious. It facilitates reproduction. So one of the things that thinkers are interested in is, why do we keep doing the same things? What facilitates that repetition or reproduction? And he argues that habitus is one of those things. So it facilitates reproduction, but not necessarily change, though he argued it opens up the potential for change. Another thing that he was interested in was what he called doxa, and this is what people take for granted, and it's similar to ideology. So here he's wrestling in different ways with these concepts, with both the idea of practice and the individual agency, what people do, but also that they're in this system that somewhat constrains them. Bourdieu is also known for exploring different types of capital. And so these are interesting to sort of put on the table. The idea of social capital is the capital that exists in between social networks. And I think of this as sort of who you know. Cultural capital is the knowledge, experience, and or connections that one has had through the course of their life that enables them to succeed more so than someone from a less experienced background. So I think of this as sort of what you know. Symbolic capital refers to the resources available to an individual on the basis of honor, prestige, or recognition. So it functions as an authoritative embodiment of cultural value. So it's getting at things that are important and valued within a cultural group, of which there are many, and they take many different forms, but they can be part of that doxa, something that we take for granted and don't think about. And then along similar lines, another important concept he developed is the idea of symbolic violence. And this refers to the mechanisms that lead those who are subordinated to misrecognize inequality as the natural order of things and blame themselves for their location in their society's hierarchies. So here we're getting at power structures and ideology, processes that discourage people from looking at a circumstance and understanding it in a way that can help them to question the circumstance and then possibly even push back on it. So symbolic violence would be something that would very much constrain people. Next, we'll consider the work of Edward Said, who helps us to think about this theme of power in particular. And Edward Said is known for his work on Orientalism. He is a cultural critic and political activist. He's very influential in many disciplines, anthropology and geography included. He was born in Jerusalem, but he identified as a Christian. He lived in Jerusalem, Cairo, Lebanon, went to university in the U.S. His father spent time in the U.S. He was a U.S. citizen. He fought with the United States in World War I, then returned to Jerusalem before Edward was born. Said is an example of the post-colonial school of thought. And let's look at Orientalism. He argues that this framework of Orientalism is three things, first and foremost. It is an academic designation. More generally, he argues it's a style of thought based upon the distinction between the Orient and the Occident. So he's wrestling with this history, past events and current events that frame the East and the West as two things that are in opposition. So in some ways, he's wrestling with structuralism. And thirdly, as a more historically and material defined concept, it's a Western style for dominating, restructuring, and having authority over the Orient by making statements about it. So Orientalism is then a legacy of colonial history. It's another example of post-colonial theory. And this is, again, an analysis of the legacy of that colonial history. And it's a push to gain greater engagement with the voices of people who've been colonized. And Orientalism is a concern with the other. So it's sort of analysis of the us versus them. So two different groups, and this idea again that there's somehow deep distinctions between these two groups. Orientalism, Said argued, is expressed via discourses. So here we see the influence of Foucault analysis of discourse. Discourse involves, for example, written works. And these written works can come out of institutions like academic institutions, vocabulary, the kinds of words that are used, scholarship, imagery, also the media. And Said's work involved analysis of the media, as well as art and literature. So a range of ways in which the East has been framed, or the Orient has been framed, both visually and through word, written and spoken. The goals of Orientalism, according to Said, are to show that the Orient is a European invention. It's not something that exists in and of itself. It's been created by Europe, and there's a deep history to this. So through that analysis of discourse and the treatment of the Orient in text, he's able to uncover the patterns, the ideas, the pervasiveness, and the roots, the deep roots of the framing. Another goal is to demonstrate that knowledge production is political. It is not neutral. Knowledge is not something that exists in and of itself. It is produced, and that production process is political. And another goal is to understand how Orientalism has influenced him. How does the existence of this discourse, this framing, this invention, how does it shape Edward Said himself? And so wrestling with some of this at a personal level was part of the process of theorizing this idea of Orientalism. And a couple of highlights in terms of thinking about Said's work and power. Said argued that configurations of power must be analyzed as part of an effort to understand cultures, histories, etc. So it becomes critical to understand, to go into analysis, understanding that power will be something that shapes what you see. He also argued that the relationship between the Occident or the West and the Orient and the East is a relationship of power, domination, and hegemony. So an analysis of that history of the framing reveals very clear difference in influence, authority, and power, both physical power, physical force, but also the control over ideology.